One quick note, when Liza finishes this session, we're going to offer you a chance to go upstairs to our rooftop. It's a nice day, and we have a little reception up there in the sunshine and spring weather. So please join me in welcoming Liza to the podium.
Thank you, Mike, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the Hoover Institution for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for coming and staying. I mean, this Section 702, I am well aware, can be a very dry, very technical subject. And I salute you all for recognizing its importance and for taking the time to understand the core issues that lie beneath the complexities and the jargon. I want to start by telling you a story. And to tell this story from the beginning, I have to go back to the 1940s, to the end of World War II. The national security state was in its infancy, and there were very few laws, or really even internal regulations, saying what the intelligence agencies could and couldn't do. The FBI operated without any legislative charter, and it was under pretty much the complete control of J. Edgar Hoover, who exercised a kind of tyranny over the rest of the federal government. Our wartime ally, Russia, had morphed seamlessly into an enemy, and fear of communism was everywhere. And that fear was just as great as our fear of terrorism is today. The FBI responded with a campaign of widespread domestic surveillance. The CIA and the NSA joined in the act, citing the possibility of foreign involvement in domestic movements, even though that was never proven. And gradually, over a period of decades, the specter of foreign communist influence became the basis, some might say the excuse, for the infiltration, surveillance, and systematic harassment of a range of social justice and political movements with a particular target on civil rights activism and anti-war protests. At the same time, leaders were able to use intelligence agencies' unchecked surveillance powers to dig up dirt on political opponents, pesky journalists, personal enemies, and the like. Some of us, many of us, are too young to remember that time, even if we did live through some of it. And it's difficult for us to imagine what it would be like to be afraid to speak your mind about politics or about politicians, although I do think that Muslim Americans in this country are getting a taste of that now. Most people back then knew someone who had lost their job or who had suddenly been mysteriously audited by the IRS, or whose neighbors had begun to shun them after they received a visit from an FBI agent. That was the atmosphere back then. In the 1970s, some of the worst abuses of the intelligence agencies started to come to light, and the Senate appointed a special committee, the Church Committee, to investigate. What the Church Committee found is now the stuff of legend. The CIA, a special unit of the CIA, has collected information on 7,000 Americans and 6,000 groups engaged in political activism. The NSA copied and analyzed as many as 150,000 telegrams going in and out of the US each month, which actually now seems totally quaint compared to what the NSA collects in terms of scale. But back then, that was pretty shocking. Perhaps most infamously, the FBI bugged Martin Luther King Jr.'s hotel rooms in order to get evidence of his extramarital affairs, which it then used to try to blackmail him into committing suicide. Congress and the Department of Justice responded to the Church Committee's revelations by putting in place a number of laws and policies that established a kind of golden rule. And that rule was that intelligence and law enforcement agencies could not collect information about Americans unless they had individualized, fact-based suspicion of illegal activity. Depending on how intrusive the surveillance was, they might have to get a warrant or they might have to get a subpoena, but at a minimum, there had to be reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was one of these laws. If the government acting inside the United States wanted to collect communications for foreign intelligence purposes, and if there was an American on one end of the communication, the government had to apply to a special court. Now, by the way, if it was foreign to foreign, they didn't. This was a protection for Americans. If an American was on one end, they had to go to the FISA court, and they had to show probable cause that the target was a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. And if the American was the target, that involved some level of criminal activity based on the definitions in the statute. The idea behind all of these laws was that if government officials had to point to an objective indication of wrongdoing, it would be harder for them to fall back on racial bias, on political grudges, or other improper motives. And it basically worked. It wasn't perfect, it didn't end surveillance abuses, but they became the exception instead of the rule. And it stayed that way for almost 3 decades. Then came 9/11. And just as quickly as that rule had been put into place, it was tossed aside. The individualized showing that had been required in order to get business records about Americans in foreign intelligence cases was replaced by bulk collection. The Department of Justice guidelines for domestic investigations created a new category of investigation called an assessment, which lacks a factual predicate, meaning there's actually no fact-based reason to suspect wrongdoing. The policies for searches at the borders were changed so that customs officials could search the contents of laptops and other electronic devices without reasonable suspicion, which was required before for them to read those things, of some kind of illicit activity. And then, of course, there was Section 702. So let me just stipulate that this response to the 9/11 attacks was entirely understandable. And I mean that. When something so devastating has happened, the natural instinct is to remove any barrier on the government's ability to do anything that conceivably could have stopped it. But in this instance, at least, that instinct was misguided. The 9/11 Commission found fault with many things that the intelligence agencies were doing, and it issued a slew of recommendations, but it never recommended changing the laws to remove the requirement of suspicion for surveillance, to create a regime of suspicionless surveillance. That was never recommended. And that's because there's absolutely no requirement that doing that actually helps in any way to make us safer. And I'll circle back to that at the end. So getting back to 702, we've heard a lot today about the changes that 702 made to the law. So I'll just briefly reiterate what I think are probably the 2 most fundamental ones. First, it removed the requirement of case-by-case judicial approval when an American is on one end of the communications. These days, the government is quite dismissive, even sarcastic at times, about the notion that they could ever somehow be required to get a court order to collect on a foreign target. But in fact, that's exactly what the law required from 1978 up until 2007. Second, perhaps even more important, Section 702 expanded the permissible pool of targets, and we haven't heard that much about that today, from foreign powers and agents of foreign powers to any foreigner overseas. So this isn't just a question of whether you have to get a warrant, whether you have to show probable cause, it's who these people are. And at this point, there's no requirement that the foreign target pose any threat to the United States, have any information about a threat to the United States, or be suspected of any wrongdoing. Not only does this change allow the government to target innocent private citizens overseas, it also invariably increases dramatically the number of Americans whose communications are subject to being collected. It also increases the likelihood that those Americans themselves are ordinary law-abiding citizens. So it turns surveillance that is supposed to be targeted at foreign threats into a potential dragnet. Now, the government still has to certify that acquiring foreign intelligence is one of its goals, although not necessarily the main one. That's another thing we didn't discuss today. It can be secondary. But that term, as was alluded to earlier, is broad enough to encompass conversations about current events. I've had conversations with my stepmother, who is a foreign national who lives in Switzerland, about Trump's foreign policy that the NSA could legally collect under Section 702. Now, to be very clear, I'm talking about what the law allows. In practice, the government probably does have some rationale for choosing its targets beyond the mere fact that they're foreigners overseas. I doubt my stepmother is a target of surveillance. I don't stay up at night worrying about that. But I also doubt that every target of surveillance is someone who poses a threat to the U.S. or has information about a threat, because the statute doesn't require that. More to the point, it's courting disaster to rely on any administration's commitment to self-restraint or to hope that the FISA court will lay on additional requirements beyond those that the statute actually requires. I want to address the argument we've heard today that the changes made to Section 702 were necessary to modernize FISA. And there's a bit of a creation myth here. The idea is that Congress originally intended to regulate surveillance only for wholly domestic conversations, not for international ones, but for some reason didn't say so, and instead used the method of communication, wire versus radio, as a proxy. Because methods of communication have changed with more and more international communications traveling by wire, which is true, congressional intent is being thwarted. The problem with this argument is that no one has ever managed to explain why Congress would have engaged in this very specific parsing of technologies if it simply wanted to differentiate between international and domestic communications. That would have been a much simpler law to write, but Congress didn't write that law. Moreover, proponents of this argument gloss over the fact that a significant proportion of international communications did travel by wire in 1978, between a third to a half of communications. So this notion that they used to all be radio and now they're all wire, it's just not true. So the modernization theory sounds good, but it doesn't hold up. At least it's certainly not, can't be the full explanation. There's a different technology-based argument, and they were kind of conflated in an earlier discussion, but it's a very different argument that Julian raised that makes a bit more sense, and that's the argument that certain foreign-to-foreign communications, which were clearly not covered by FISA in 1978, now transit through the U.S. in ways that bring them within FISA scope. And this is true for one category of communications, and that's foreign-to-foreign emails that are stored on U.S. soil. But the changes made by Section 702 obviously went far beyond what would be necessary, as Julian was saying, to address that discrete problem. The truth is, changes in technology were affecting the NSA's ability to conduct surveillance in the years before 702 was passed, but they were making surveillance easier, not harder. The reach of government surveillance in 1978 was substantially constrained by technological limitations and cost constraints on electronic communication itself, and also on the government's ability to acquire, store, and process all of these communications. Over the past couple of decades, these constraints have become negligible. And the government has unprecedented capabilities today to tap in to communications which have exploded, all kinds of communications, and to store them in the petabytes and to use sophisticated computer analytics to sort through them. So this is truly the golden age of surveillance. And there's another aspect to this. In past decades, international communication versus purely domestic was relatively rare because it was difficult and expensive. Today, in our interconnected world, it is cheap, it's easy, sometimes it's free, and it's necessary. Can I just have a show of hands? Who here has communicated with a foreigner overseas at least a few times in the last year? Okay, I think that's everybody. So what all this international communication means is that the amount of information about Americans that the NSA intercepts, even when targeting foreigners overseas, has increased dramatically. And yet, instead of increasing American safeguards for privacy, the law has gone in the opposite direction. The vastly expanded scope of 702 to any foreigner overseas has turned FISA into a tool for mass surveillance. What do I mean by that? In 2011, according to the FISA court, the NSA was collecting 250 million communications a year under Section 702. That number is almost certainly higher today, if only because the number of targets, of reported targets, has risen steadily each year. And as we know, the government is generally allowed to keep these communications for about 5 years. So that means at any given time, there are well over a billion communications that are stored in government databases from 702. How many of those communications have an American on one end of them? Wouldn't we like to know? This is the question that lawmakers have been asking the NSA for years. The NSA's original response was, we don't know. It would be too time-consuming and expensive to find out, and it would violate Americans' privacy to find out. This last one is not quite as crazy as it sounds. My first response was, what? It's true that for some kinds of communications, the government would have to do some digging to figure out if there's an American on one end. But there's also another way to do this. And for upstream collection, the government is required, as a constitutional matter, to apply a filter, to try to filter out wholly domestic communications on the front end. The way it does that is through a combination of using the IP address and certain other techniques that it has. And it says that it can reliably screen out the vast majority of domestic communications in that way. If that technique, IP addresses plus, is sufficient to identify who's a U.S. person for purposes of complying with a constitutional requirement. It's sufficient for purpose of giving us an estimate of how many Americans' communications are picked up. And, in fact, under President Obama, the Director of National Intelligence finally agreed that they would do this, that they would try to do this. They came up with some methodologies. They briefed lawmakers and civil liberties advocates on the methodologies. They were ready to go. And then, mysteriously, for the past few months, we've heard nothing about it. And then we start hearing again from spokespersons for the government, oh, it's very difficult. Oh, there are privacy concerns. So we were on the verge of getting that number. And now somehow it's out of our grasp. I'm going to state the obvious here. The government can't have it both ways. Officials can't simultaneously reassure us that Section 702's effect on Americans' privacy is absolutely minimal, while in the same breath saying that they have no idea and not even a sense, not even a ballpark, and no way to figure it out, how many Americans' communications are being swept up. In the absence of an official estimate, we're left to draw our own conclusions from the publicly available information. The Washington Post reviewed a sample of Section 702 communications obtained from Edward Snowden and reported that approximately half of those communications contained some U.S. person information. Now, we have no way of knowing if that's a representative sample, but if you assume that it is, that means that approximately 125 million communications a year would have some U.S. person information in them. And at any given time, there would be about half a billion such communications in the government's databases. Again, that could be wildly off, but in the absence of any official data, that's the best we can do. Even if there were the strictest possible minimization requirements on the back end, this kind of mass collection and storing of Americans' communications is extremely problematic for several reasons. First, there's the potential for abuse, for government officials to simply disregard the limits on the handling of this data and to misuse it for personal or political purposes. I agree there has been very little evidence of that to date. And I think it's true that the laws and the institutions put in place after the Church Committee changed the culture within these agencies, in general, in a very positive way. People in the agencies sometimes talk about a culture of compliance. But the laws and institutions that led to this cultural shift are the same ones that have been steadily eroded since 9/11. And it doesn't take a clairvoyant to see that the culture within these agencies might start to change too. Moreover, while we haven't seen much evidence of intentional abuse, we've seen a remarkable pattern of failures on the part of agencies to comply with FISA court orders. Yes, people are human and they make mistakes, but I'm not talking about a handful of trivial incidents. I'm talking about significant and sustained violations of court-ordered limits on collection, retention, querying, and sharing. In many cases, these violations went undetected for years and then unreported for even longer, during which time government lawyers were misrepresenting the NSA's activities or the agency's activities to the FISA court. And the most recent example can be seen in the April 26 opinion of this year that was discussed earlier. Now, these violations are ostensibly inadvertent, but an inadvertent privacy violation is still a privacy violation. And the history of repeated systemic violations suggests that one of two things must be happening. Either the agencies just aren't trying that hard to comply, and I don't want to reach that conclusion, or they're trying very hard, but they can't. They're incapable of avoiding serious repeated violations, maybe because the system has become so large and so technologically complex. Either of those explanations gives me very little reassurance when the government is asking us to trust it with tens, maybe hundreds of millions of our communications. That leads me to another concern. I would love to think that the intelligence community does a better job of securing its data than, say, the Office of Personnel Management. But it wasn't too long ago that WikiLeaks disclosed the CIA's hacking tools. So it's, their record isn't perfect. And all of this information about presumptively innocent Americans as well as innocent foreigners is sitting there in massive databases that are a very attractive target for hackers because they also include some potentially very valuable foreign intelligence information. And so you can see how the Russian government or the Chinese government might be interested in this data. Now, I've been talking about Americans' privacy, but we also need to consider the effects of allowing the government to target any foreigner overseas. Foreigners may not have Fourth Amendment rights, but they do have rights to privacy that are acknowledged under international law, including treaties to which the United States is a party. And the mass collection of foreigners' emails and phone calls is very likely a violation of those international obligations. At least that is becoming the consensus position of courts and legal authorities in Europe. As a direct result, the agreements that US technology companies have reached with counterparts in Europe in order to do business overseas have been struck down, and they are in jeopardy. So there was one that was struck down in 2015, there's another that replaced it. That one may not survive if Section 702 is not amended in some form when it's reauthorized. This is a serious economic threat to the American tech sector, which is why more than 30 companies, including Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, signed a letter last week urging significant reforms of Section 702. For all of these reasons, strong back-end protections can't cure the problem of overly broad collection on the front end. Conversely, narrowing collection at the front end isn't going to eliminate the need for strong back-end protections. We heard this earlier. It's the nature of surveillance. In any kind of surveillance you do, you are going to end up with incidental collection, collecting innocent conversations as a result of that surveillance. And that's why minimization is required as a constitutional matter as well as a statutory one. The concept behind minimization in the 702 context is fairly simple. The interception of Americans' communications when targeting foreigners is inevitable. But because such interception ordinarily would require a warrant or an individual FISA order, incidentally collected U.S. person information generally should not be kept or used or shared, subject to narrow exceptions. The statutory minimization requirement, however, is almost entirely lacking in specifics. It leaves the details to the agencies. And not surprisingly, the agency's minimization procedures contain numerous exceptions and have grown more and more permissive over the years as the inevitable mission creep has set in. Trying to decide how much to tell you about it. How interested are you in knowing about the minimization procedures? Show of hands. So I'm seeing some nodding. I'm just going to go ahead. Oh, not many hands, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. So to begin with, the NSA can share the raw data with the NSA. Sorry, they are the NSA, with the CIA, the FBI, now also the National Counterterrorism Center as of recently. All of these agencies are generally allowed to keep the raw data, including U.S. person raw data, not minimized, for 5 years after the certification requires. So right there, they can keep the U.S. person data for 5 years. They can also seek extensions at that time from a high-level official. And the 5-year limit doesn't apply if the communications are encrypted, which is increasingly the case for people who use ordinary mobile devices. If the NSA discovers U.S. person data that has no foreign intelligence value and contains no evidence of crime, the agency is supposed to purge that data. But the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board found that it essentially doesn't, because it can almost always posit a reason why maybe someday it might be relevant. So they basically keep it all. And the FBI and the CIA don't even have that requirement to purge on detection. They just rely on the 5-year age off. Moreover, if the FBI reviews information concerning U.S. persons and comes to no conclusion about whether or not it's foreign intelligence, literally no conclusion, they just look at it, don't know, the 5-year limitation at that point evaporates and is replaced with some longer period of time that is still classified. So I'll just, that's enough of that, because that's really the weedy stuff. But it goes to show that the words we talk about, targeting, minimization, incidental, they don't mean what people ordinarily think of when they hear these words. That's not minimizing the retention of U.S. person information. It's putting some restrictions on it, but not minimizing by any definition of the term. The most controversial and disturbing aspect of the minimization procedures is that they allow the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI to search through raw Section 702 data using U.S. person identifiers with the express goal of finding and reviewing Americans' communications. And this, of course, is the backdoor search loophole. Remember, if the government wants to obtain an American's emails or phone calls in a foreign intelligence investigation, it has to go to the FISA court and show probable cause that the American is a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. If the government wants to obtain an American's phone calls or emails in a law enforcement investigation, it has to go and get a warrant. To ensure that Section 702 is not used to avoid these requirements, the statute contains a prohibition on reverse targeting. Before conducting Section 702 surveillance, the government has to certify that its interest lies only in the foreign target and that it does not intend to target any particular known American. That's what makes it legal in the beginning, is that certification. Only interested in the foreigners, not the Americans, not any particular known Americans. And yet, the moment the data is in their hands, all three agencies can sort through it looking for the communications of particular known Americans, the very people in whom the government just disclaimed any interest. And the FBI can even search for those communications to use in ordinary criminal cases that have nothing to do with foreign intelligence or with national security. I've said it many times, I'll say it again, this is a bait and switch that is totally inconsistent with the spirit, if not the letter, of the reverse targeting prohibition, and it creates a very dangerous end run around the Fourth Amendment. Now, I've heard intelligence officials defend backdoor searches on the ground that once information is lawfully collected, it can be used for any purpose. I think Alex did an excellent job earlier of explaining why that's not the case. I just want to add on top of that the very definition of minimization is you can't use it for any purpose. That's what minimization means. And that's not only a statutory requirement, that's a constitutional requirement as well. And the FISA court has plainly said, and I quote, "The procedures governing retention, use, and dissemination bear on the reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment of a program for collecting foreign intelligence information." So what is the path forward? Listening to me speak, you would think that I am completely against Section 702 in every way and I want it to lapse. But everything I've been talking about is outside the core of what Section 702 was supposed to do. And what it was supposed to do was to allow the government to go after foreign threats, suspected terrorists, and not have to get a warrant to do it. I think there are several changes that should be made to Section 702. There are two major ones that I want to discuss today fairly quickly. I know I'm standing between you and cocktails, but none of those changes go to the heart of Section 702, which is warrant collection on suspected foreign threats. I believe that that can stay in place. And we can still, with that in place, we can still address the most serious civil liberties issues, which arise not from that, but from all of this sort of penumbra and ways in which the law is much broader than it ever had to be to do what it was supposed to do. So, in reverse order, arguably, the backdoor loophole should be shut. The government should have to obtain a warrant in order to search Section 702 data for Americans' communications in criminal investigations. It should have to get a FISA order to search communications in foreign intelligence investigations. By the way, there is a precedent for requiring the government to go get a warrant for information it has already acquired. In criminal cases where the government has made electronic copies of computers or iPhones and has seized those and has gotten a warrant to search them, it has then been required by the courts to go back and get a second warrant if it wants to do a later search, even though it lawfully acquired and has that information. So this is not unprecedented. As for the proposal to allow the government to search only for metadata, and then if something comes up, to have to then get a warrant to look at the content, we have a process for the government to search for Americans' metadata. It's Section 215. The government can go to the FISA court, show relevance to the investigation, and get a court order to search for metadata. So I'm not on board with the idea that they can do it with absolutely no process whatsoever as a kind of a compromise. So in addition to closing the backdoor search loophole, the scope of permissible targets should be narrowed. And this is something I also agree that the end of about collection should be codified. I think that was covered earlier. I want to talk about something we haven't spoken about as much. The government should have to have a reasonable belief. I'm not talking about a warrant. I'm not talking about a probable cause standard. It should have to at least have a reasonable belief that the target is a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power or in some way poses a threat or has an information about a threat to the United States. There is no reason to think that this would make Section 702 less effective. In every case that the government has publicly cited, including the Zazi case, as evidence of Section 702's importance, the initial surveillance targeted a suspected terrorist, someone the government already knew or believed to have terrorist ties. And when government officials have discussed the larger non-public pool of success stories, they've described them the same way. So Matt Olson, who spoke earlier, testified last year that the typical Section 702 success story has involved what he called narrowly focused surveillance, targeting a specific foreign individual overseas based on the government's reasonable belief that the individual was involved with terrorist activities. Needless to say, these cases do not support the idea that the government needs the authority to target any foreigner overseas and collect all of his communications with Americans. So the good news is we can do this. We can have a foreign intelligence surveillance law that gives the government broad latitude to go after foreign threats without getting a warrant. At the same time, we can protect the privacy of innocent Americans and foreigners through stricter minimization requirements and a more sensible pool of permissible targets. And we can preserve the foundational principle that the government must get a warrant if it wants to listen to an American's phone calls or read an American's emails. Now, intelligence officials will say that we can't do it, or that we shouldn't do it. And they'll say that any additional limitations on their authority to conduct surveillance will make us less safe. They made the same argument when Congress was considering the recommendations of the Church Committee back in the 1970s. And I think they believed it, and I think they believe it now. But that brings us full circle, because the alternative to moving forward with reforms is to move backward to a time when Americans were afraid of their own government. At some time in the future, and perhaps the not too distant future, the self-restraint and the self-policing and the culture of compliance that have kept the government from taking full advantage of the tremendous legal license contained in Section 702 will fail unless we act. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions that don't relate to like what drinks are going to be you can order when you get upstairs? Yes.
This may sound like a really stupid question, but I'd like you to try to walk us through two situations. The first situation is under your reforms. If you target a foreigner and you pull up, and the Snowden seemed to suggest you could pull up a Facebook page, you could pull up chats, and there's an American at the other end. If you could, under your system, you could read that, and there's something on the American end that is suspicious, wouldn't that by definition give you enough to get a warrant?
Well, so that you're raising another set of reforms, which I didn't talk about. But in addition to getting the warrant and closing the backdoor search loophole, another important set of reforms that is under consideration is use limitations, and that's when you can use information that you actually bump into as you're looking through. And again, the idea is this is information you wouldn't have had unless you had certified. We're not interested in the American. We're only interested in the foreigner. You got it without a warrant for that reason. So then the question becomes, how much use should the government have of information that it bumps into? No, I want to be very clear. I think that usually when this happens, I think the bigger threat is the backdoor search, because I don't think it's that often that accidentally the government bumps into a random crime that's being committed by an American when they're reading. Go on.
And maybe I'm just being thick here, but is a backdoor search just throwing the name of an American into a search query as opposed to already having some information from having queried the foreign target?
Yeah, it's the difference between going looking for that information versus stumbling across it. So you could imagine if you had a warrant at the front end, which you don't, which is the key difference, but let's say you did, then the analogy would be if you're searching a house and you find a murder weapon, and you're searching for the murder weapon, that's what the warrant says. And it's the difference between literally tripping over a bag of drugs on your way to go find the murder weapon versus finding the murder weapon and then saying, I think I'm going to go look for some drugs, which you can't do.
I'll stop after this. In the Snowden movie, he shows you see the
I haven't
screenshot
seen
of
it.
the spider web of all of these connections. Is the abuse we're worried about that there's a targeting of a foreigner reasonably thought to be abroad? And at what point is the American wrongfully searched in that process? Is it that information has already been pulled up by the NSA about this foreign target? Or is it just that there's information about this foreign target that is in a database blind, and you throw the American's name in as a search item?
They're two different concerns. I mean, they're both concerns, and they're theoretically distinguishable, but they are both concerns. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. You.
I don't know if you do a lot of interaction with staffers on the Hill, but do you see, there was mention earlier of kind of surprising potential allies.
Yeah.
Have you talked to any of these people who previously supported kind of these strong surveillance authorities and now have questions about it? And do you think that they're open to kind of serious reforms that aren't politically motivated?
So without naming names, I think the sort of wild card here is people who are very strong defenders of Section 702 in the past, such as Devin Nunes, who is now has said things that seemed critical of it, but then he seemed to be walking a line where he wasn't so much criticizing the law, but just criticizing how it was used. But I think there are a lot of people who, and this is my sense from being up on the Hill, who, Republicans and Democrats, who voted for this law without really understanding that well what was in it. And I don't fault them. I mean, I don't understand how they stay on top of everything they have to stay on top of. I really don't. I think it's a big problem. But this is complicated under the best of circumstances. And I think that they listened to people like Jim Baker, who came in and said, we need this authority. And Jim clearly believes that and is acting in good faith. And they said, we trust you. And they granted the authority. And they didn't really know what was involved in it. And I think as some of the details are coming out, and as they're focusing more on it, I think there's going to be room for some of those people to say, not let's get rid of 702, not this is a travesty, not we need a warrant anytime we target a foreigner, but can we trim some of the fat around the edges of this law, which is kind of where most of the risks are, frankly. Do we really need the ability to get any foreigner overseas? Could we maybe be a little more specific what we meant about minimization so that the stuff isn't held onto for 5 years or longer if the FBI looks at it and says, I don't know. So I think we might see that level of engagement from some people, and that's welcome. Yeah.
So you keep bringing up the fact that, and I'm no expert, but you kept mentioning that the law basically says if you're a foreigner overseas, we can target you willy-nilly. We don't have to have a reason. But as far as I understand it, there's a third component to that, and that's the foreign intelligence value.
Yep.
So it's not just that you're a foreigner overseas, but there's the third component, which is the reason that we're targeting you.
Yeah, I did mention that, and what I said about that is it can be, first of all, it can be your secondary reason. Your primary reason can be something else entirely, but you have to have it.
Okay, but I don't know that that's true. I mean, there are 3 things that you have to meet to target somebody under 702.
Well, the court has said that that's true. I mean, I didn't. That's not my reading of it. That's actually what the law says is that a significant purpose has to be the collection of foreign intelligence, and the FISA court has said it doesn't have to be the primary purpose.
Well, in the compliance world, those are 3 things that are double checked and triple checked and quadruple checked to make sure exists. That there
Absolutely.
are 3 things.
Absolutely.
And the foreign intelligence value is critical to making sure that a target is a legitimate target before you can go and collect on them.
Sure, and
so
foreign intelligence.
Assuming that happens and that's true, and it's not just willy-nilly random mass collection of anyone who's overseas, if there is incidental collection and that person really is a target, a legitimate target, because there's some derogatory information that's leading us to think that that person could do us harm in some way, and that incidental collection happens to be a U.S. person or one of our allies, a Canadian citizen, whatever, that is in close contact with someone we suspect is a terrorist, wouldn't you want to know that?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you want the FBI to know that?
Sure.
I do.
Sure. I mean,
So,
nothing you've said is, I mean, you said if we have information this person wants to do us
And
harm.
I want them to know that quickly. I don't want them to have to wait a week to get a warrant for that information.
Yeah,
So,
I'm not disagreeing with you.
but closing that back door, I mean, what you're calling that is the backdoor loophole. or whatever.
No. The backdoor search loophole is when you say, I want to read the communication of this American, not Canadian. I want to read the information of this American, this guy. I think this guy might be up to something, so I'm going to plug that into my database, and I'm going to read his email.
That's not how that system works.
Yeah, it is. That's how. I mean, you've already collected the data based on an foreign intelligence purpose. But at the point they put in the U.S. person identifier, they don't have to have a foreign intelligence purpose. They can put that identifier into the database when they're doing a routine assessment in a criminal investigation. Remember, an assessment is when they don't have a factual predicate. So they can actually read an American's emails, listen to their phone calls, when they don't even have a factual basis to suspect wrongdoing, let alone a foreign intelligence purpose. And that's in the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board report. Again, it's not a conclusion I'm drawing. But to go back to what you said before, the foreign intelligence purpose limitation is unfortunately not that much of a limitation because of the definition of foreign intelligence, which is not derogatory information suggesting someone means to do us harm. I would love it if that were the definition. But it's any information that is relevant to the conduct of the foreign affairs of the United States. That is one of the definitions. And that includes my phone calls to my stepmother about Trump's foreign policy. Again, I'm not paranoid. I agree, but it fits the...
On the radar.
So if she and I talk about the merits of NAFTA, is NAFTA foreign policy?
I mean, I wouldn't know if they were on some list of, I wouldn't know.
I'm worried about what the law allows, not what is done right now, but what might be done a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now. And I think we can narrow this law in a way that allows what you're talking about, which is going after people who pose some harm to the United States and doing it without a warrant, without reading Americans' phone calls without an email, or having these definitions that would in fact allow conversations with my stepmother to be swept up. I don't think they are, but yes.
Thanks for the talk. And just sort of, I don't know, disclosure, but I'm sort of in the camp that believes that this is an important program, but continuing reform and oversight, and especially as technology evolves, to remain vigilant. And so I appreciate what you're doing. So my question is sort of about the more vulnerable Americans, and I think we often forget this. So I know I have friends who are Muslim Americans, people who've ended up on the no-fly list for no reason other than the fact that they have relatives in Pakistan. This was during sort of the immediate post-9/11 paranoia. We forget this. I mean, and I have chosen a path where I'm more in the public eye. I'm in diplomatic circles. I assume my stuff is swept up by someone. It might be the Russians, and then the NSA steals it, and I have to trust that, the oversight. And currently, I do, but I am worried about erosion. But I'm also a rich white guy from Boston who's well educated.
I'm from Boston.
Are
Where?
You? Wayland, just outside.
Belmont.
Oh, cool. So, ultimately, let's be honest with ourselves here. No one's coming for me. I'm fine. I'm lucky in this society. Not everyone is that lucky.
Can I tell you a story?
And people forget how afraid Muslim Americans are right now, or Christians from Syria, or Sikhs, and they're targeted right now.
Yeah.
By fellow citizens.
So I write a lot about a lot of very critical things about this current administration, and I recently traveled internationally, and it occurred to me on the way back that I might be one of those people whose laptops or cell phones got searched, and when it wasn't, I was a little disappointed. I thought, how many op-eds do I have to write? But you're right. I mean, I chose that sort of public speaking and all of that. I chose that, and I chose to speak out about certain issues that I know could potentially, and there are lots of people, including Muslim Americans, including immigrants, who are probably very worried and who didn't ask for any of this. And one of the harms of over collection, as opposed to one of the reasons why I don't agree with, well, we'll just collect it all, but then we'll have these really stringent safeguards on the back end, is because just the fact of that collection and the potential that it could be abused causes an immediate and concrete harm, which is a chilling effect, a measurable chilling effect, not a subjective whiffy thing, but a measurable chilling effect on the willingness of certain vulnerable populations' willingness to speak freely. And it has been, I mean, in the wake of the Snowden disclosures, there was a 5% drop that Google measured in government-sensitive search terms. So CIA, dirty bomb, things like that. A measurable drop in people being willing to type those things into Google. Not other sensitive words like abortion or something like that, but just those kinds of things. So right there, that's across the population. Then Muslim Americans, I don't think their response to the 702 has been measured specifically, but the response to the NYPD surveillance, there's been some studies on that. Really dramatic stuff in terms of declines in membership in Muslim student associations, declines in mosque attendance. I mean, things that should hit us just as deeply, things we should be just as afraid of as we are of security incidents, because this is who we are as a people. Can we talk to each other? Can we air our political differences without being afraid that it might be heard the wrong way by the NSA? Thank you for raising that.
That was great. Thank you.